My name is Adam Frankel. I was a Circumnavigators Club Foundation grant recipient in 2002, and I went to Princeton University. And the subject of my research was community responses to HIV/AIDS, the global AIDS pandemic around the world, sponsored by the New York chapter. My mother was a researcher focusing on HIV and AIDS patients in the early 1980s in New York City, and so I guess I was familiar with the illness from an early age in that respect. But when I was in college, the world was facing this global pandemic, and with just sort of horrific reports from sub-Saharan Africa and around the world. And so it was a topic that a number of sort of student activists like me were engaged with. The reason the countries I selected were twofold. One was it was an opportunity to look at the ways in which the pandemic kind of was taking place. It was sort of manifesting itself in different ways globally, and the causes and sources of it were manifesting themselves differently, and the way that the governments and communities were responding to it differently. So, for example, in some places, it was being driven by intravenous drug use. That was part of why I went to Russia, because that was an issue in particular there. In some places, I focused on what was referred to as MSM, men having sex with men, as a source of transmission, which was the case in India, in some of the communities I visited there, so I basically took a broad view of looking at some of the drivers of the pandemic, as well as the government responses, or lack of responses. There's a huge amount of stigma and unwillingness on the part of governments and communities to deal with this, in part because of some of the drivers of it, including intravenous drug use or anything else. And so that was sort of what motivated in part what motivated why I went to different the countries I visited. And also, frankly, the other thing that motivated was it was an extraordinary opportunity to learn about the world and see the world and visit parts of the world that I had never been to. And so part of the motivation for choosing the countries, including China, was just to sort of expand my horizon of my understanding of the world and cultures around the world. And I'd never been to China, and I was eager to go. When I was in China, I traveled to Beijing and I traveled to Kunming in the southwest in Yunnan province. And, it was just sort of, my memories there were frankly less about the research and more just the experience of being in China as a college student who didn't speak Mandarin, and, on my own, kind of finding my way, staying in hostels and trying to figure things out. It was incredible. I mean, when I landed in Beijing at night, and it turned out my Lonely Planet guide was out of date, and the hostel that I planned to stay in was not picking up. And it turned out it happened to be the case that on the flight over there, I was a family friend, just by coincidence. And when I landed there and was unable to communicate with the hostel, I ended up staying with some of her friends in Beijing. I don't know what I would have done if that hadn't been the case. It was just amazing just going down I took a train from Beijing to Kunming, which was, a day or two long train ride. And just seeing the topography of the whole country sort of change before my eyes, and sort of befriending some of the people in the hostel in Kunming, was getting a feel, just getting immersed in the history and culture of the place. I mean, I remember the stone forest outside Kunming, which is this extraordinary monument landscape site with these pillars of stone, and the bakeries of Kunming. I mean, those are sort of my memories. I remember meeting with some government officials in Vietnam to talk about what they were doing to tackle the pandemic. And I mean, where we are now, when there have been sort of robust efforts to combat the pandemic, and it is not on the scale that it was then. I mean, I don't think back then we could have imagined that we'd be in a place where the HIV/AIDS pandemic has been in recent years globally. But the people I do vividly remember talking to government officials there who were creating and leading programs tackling HIV/AIDS. I mean, the trip there, I went to Hanoi and Saigon, and I mean, I remember it was just extraordinary, you know, Hanoi, just seeing Hanoi and getting to visit that beautiful city as a college student, taking the train. Again, I took what was called the Unification Express from Hanoi to Saigon through the, you know, through the jungles at night, very hot, very humid, but getting to see and going to some of the museums in Saigon having to do with the war. I left Vietnam by boat. I took a boat from Saigon on the Mekong into Cambodia, and seeing all the little villages along the way was just incredible. Cambodia was a pretty great, sort of sobering experience to be in Cambodia, which seemed like it had emerged from the war only a few years before. I mean, the Phnom Penh still seemed pretty, dismal, at least in many parts of it. Street side, you know, building numbers written with graffiti on the streets, on the buildings themselves, and that sort of thing. And the main sites that tourists seem to gravitate to were the killing fields and Tuol Sleng, which would have been the torture chamber used by the Khmer Rouge. So you couldn't go to Phnom Penh or anywhere around there without really feeling very firsthand or in a very visceral way the legacy of the genocide and the war, and a whole generation sort of missing when you sort of looked around the streets. And then on the other hand, I took a flight to Siem Reap and got to see Angkor Wat, and so you sort of are confronted by this extraordinarily rich cultural legacy, beautiful, just beautiful and breathtaking on the one hand, and then this horrific, much more recent legacy as well. I think that it was the governments recognized what was going on. Whether they were willing to do anything about it was a very different matter. And in a lot of places, they were not willing to do anything that much about it. A lot of the work and a lot of the people I met with ended up not being not just government officials, but NGOs and activists. They were doing a lot of the work, often, fighting the government, on it, and doing it despite lack of government engagement. And so they were the real kind of the heroes who I sort of met with, were these people who were just sort of fighting, doing everything they could to raise awareness and education about how to prevent the transmission of HIV, trying to and sort of care for those who had HIV or full-blown AIDS. So I landed in Delhi without a place to stay. What happened was I wanted to go to India as part of my trip, but this was the summer after 9/11. And there was a travel ban on Americans traveling there. And the travel ban was lifted, I think, within days or weeks or something of when I had hoped to go. And so I was already on the trip when the travel ban was lifted. And I remember communicating with the foundation and saying, I really want to go. And they said, okay, but I didn't have an itinerary. Because I hadn't been planning to go. And so I didn't have anywhere to stay. So I flew to Delhi. I ended up befriending an Israeli soldier at the airport, and he was on, I don't know, he'd just gotten out or he was on a break or something. And in Delhi, there's a whole community where a lot of Israelis go to Delhi for R&R. And there's like a whole neighborhood in Delhi where, where shop signs are written in Hebrew, and the shopkeepers speak fluent Hebrew and stuff. And so, which I had no idea about. And so I ended up accompanying him and some of his friends, and found a hostel there, and went up to. I remember going up to Amritsar, where I had a family friend near the border, and there was and there were Indian soldiers on the train who were going up to Kashmir, which was, I guess, the same route. Just an extraordinary, just sort of another kind of world, the widening perspective kind of trip. I do remember also on that trip being at the Taj Mahal. I visited the Taj Mahal, and I don't know what I was reading or writing in a journal or something right by the Taj Mahal, and a group of men surrounded me and asked me how many people I was traveling with and where I was from. And I very quickly pointed to a group, I don't know, 100 feet away, and said, "Oh, I'm with them. I'm traveling with them, and I'm from Canada." And they talked among themselves a little bit and then left. But it was, there was a little bit of the post, as I say, this was the summer after 9/11. A lot of that stuff was kind of floating in the air, and made the trip a little bit more, and so that sort of hung over the trip a little bit. Yeah, I was in Kenya. I don't know that I met with government folks in Kenya. I was only there for a day, maybe a day or two. But I certainly did. I went on a safari, and I'm not going to Kenya and leaving without going on safari. So I did that. It was like the wildebeest migration, went to Serengeti. It was Serengeti, and it was just extraordinary, breathtaking. In Botswana, I visited there was a center that had been set up in partnership with Harvard at the center in Gaborone or Gaborone, or the capital of Botswana. There were AIDS patients, people with full-blown AIDS. This is where they sort of spent their time and were cared for in a very, to say cared for is probably an overstatement. It was just a room for them with people who cared about them, who would bring them water and food. They weren't getting treated in any notable way, as far as I could tell. Although I suppose it's possible that they were being provided, antiretrovirals or some drugs. But it wasn't really a hospice. If you'd walked in, you could have been mistaken for thinking it was a hospice. But that was not the ostensible purpose of it, at least as I recall it. But yeah, it was just sort of a heartbreaking thing. I just remember these people just lying in these couches. They were alive, they were resting, but they were. It was hard. It was just a hard situation. And that's a memory and image. Certainly never leave me. The most inspiring part of the whole trip was in Zimbabwe. I went to Bulawayo, which is a town, a relatively small town. Actually, I didn't go to Bulawayo. I went to outside Bulawayo in the bush, as I was told, as it was described to me. And it was a Salvation Army camp, basically for AIDS orphans. And it was like it was in the all out, so all outdoors. They had these sort of huts where everybody stayed. But it was all kind of team building, trust building, zip lining. There were, songs and campfires and all kinds of outdoor activities for kids to sort of have fun, build relationships, get some support. All these children from families where they'd lost one or more parent to AIDS, and that was just a really inspiring thing to see, and especially on a trip that was a pretty bleak, frankly. I mean, what I was seeing across all of the countries was just the scale of the pandemic, but not a whole, I wouldn't exactly say a comprehensive and effective government or community responses everywhere. It was more sort of individual NGOs doing good work, some government programs here and there that were taking on parts of the issue. But that was a bright spot, seeing that. It was also, Mugabe was running the country, as he had for so many years, and it was a sort of strange experience to be there, trading currency on the black market, and I remember asking somebody about Mugabe on the train out to Bulawayo, which sort of shows my naivete at even asking the question. But like, when I asked the question, they looked around and lowered their voice. So in Russia, I went to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and my main memory of being in Russia, and I think it was St. Petersburg, where was meeting with NGOs funded by Open Society Institute, the Soros Foundation, that were working on needle exchange programs and working with intravenous drug users to stem the transmission of HIV that way. And they were doing so, I remember it being sort of very controversial, and just sort of really admiring the people who were doing it, because they were doing it in the face of government opposition, or at least no help from the government. Part of what stuck with me over the course of the whole trip was just the magnitude and scale of the problem, and how overwhelming it seemed, frankly, being in all of these different countries and seeing the way in which this illness was ravaging people and communities and whole regions. And at the end of it, feeling like I didn't know, quite frankly, how such a problem of that magnitude could possibly be overcome. And especially in the face of governments that were not, very actively, many governments that were not so actively engaged. Certainly not. It did not seem like it was safe for members of the queer community to be out. I mean, the places where I engaged with the way in which HIV sort of ravaged the LGBTQ community was mostly in India, but it was the NGO. I remember meeting with an NGO that was working with. I mean, it wasn't referred to as LGBTQ community. It was what they referred to it was, and men having sex with men. They said they're not gay; they're men having sex with men. And it was certainly there was a huge amount of stigma around it there, and in all the other countries I visited as well. Which again just gave me all the more admiration and respect for the people who were working on these issues, especially it's a HIV/AIDS has historically is one of the viruses that it targets marginalized communities. That's just sort of what happens. And the people who were fighting on behalf of those communities were really doing heroic work, I thought. The reality with the history of the way HIV/AIDS was tackled in the US and globally was it really was driven by activists. I mean, it was, gay men's health crisis in the 80s and other activists in the US and around the world pushing on governments who are very slow to act. And I think that that's sort of the story of progress, no matter what we're talking about. I mean, that's the story of the civil rights movement in the United States. It's a story of any movement and for progress. I mean, it comes from the grassroots, from the streets. And I certainly saw that with HIV/AIDS, and we see that today with whether it's Black Lives Matter or any other social justice movement. I think what the trip helped me learn and see was just the way in which all these levers come together, both from the activists to the policymakers, to help drive forward progress. It's funny, I look at photographs of me after when I got back, and I was wearing these like Indian garbs that I bought. I grew my hair, my hair grew out. And so I remember coming back and thinking, and thinking like that my academic studies suddenly seem very unimportant. And that in light of the activists who I'd been met with and the scale of the suffering that I had just seen, I was sort of like the book learning suddenly looked a little different to me. I think the equilibrium restored itself over time, but I remember when I first came back, that was sort of, I really reaffirmed my activism. I mean, I started a chapter of Student Global AIDS Campaign at Princeton, which, and we did a whole bunch of different kinds of protests and activists, and sort of awareness raising campaigns and that sort of thing. And I wrote my my thesis at Princeton on the U.S. response to the global AIDS pandemic. And so it definitely was a formative experience. I graduated from Princeton and I got a Fulbright to go to the London School of Economics. So I studied there for a bit. It was essentially a European history course there, and left there early to join the Kerry campaign as a speechwriter. I interned in the Clinton White House in speechwriting. I caught the tail end of the Clinton administration, and one of Bill Clinton's junior speechwriters at the time brought me onto the Kerry campaign. On the Kerry campaign, I became buddies with one of the other speechwriters, a guy named John Favreau. And when Kerry lost, Favreau went to work for then Senator Barack Obama. He'd just been elected to the Senate. And we stayed in touch. And I went back to New York after Kerry lost and helped Ted Sorensen write on his memoirs. Ted was JFK's close advisor and speechwriter. And Favreau and I you were in touch throughout that period of 2006-07, and he brought me onto the Obama campaign as a junior speechwriter, as a sort of deputy speechwriter in 2007. I flew out and moved to Chicago a couple of weeks after Obama announced his candidacy, and it was one of the three primary speechwriters on that campaign. Stayed in the White House through the first term as a senior speechwriter to President Obama, and then left. I worked I led a nonprofit for a little bit. I was at a startup for a bit, and then was at PepsiCo for some years there as a VP of corporate communications, and wrote a book that came out in 2019. I left. Part of the reason I left PepsiCo, I wrote a book about my sort of family's, about the way sort of trauma has reverberated through the generations in my family. It's called The Survivors, published by HarperCollins in 2019, about how the trauma of World War II and the Holocaust has reverberated in my family. And more recently, I was a senior advisor to Lorene Powell Jobs and Emerson Collective, and continued to advise other business leaders and companies, and took a leave of absence from doing that earlier this year to serve as a senior advisor in the vice president's office, which is what I'm currently doing. So that, I think, was the most extraordinary part about it. Just the personal growth and personal experience of traveling like that. I mean, the research topic that I chose, I thought at the time and still think was important. I was also sort of a college student doing research on this, and so sort of the, my sort of methodology and research skills were fairly limited as like a college sophomore. I did the best I could, but I would say the most lasting impact on me was just the personal experience of traveling like that. I mean, traveling around the world in your early 20s without knowing anyone in the countries you're visiting, not speaking the language of any of most of the countries you're visiting, spending a lot of time by yourself necessarily, and having to just sort of rely on yourself in all kinds of situations. It was a great experience. I think a really important experience. It was a life-changing experience for me, just to be put in those sorts of situations and to see the world in that way. You just come to trust yourself more and realize that you can handle, whatever comes up, because you kind of need to. You also learn, I think it sort of imposes on you a little bit a sort of generosity of spirit, because you have no choice but to depend on the kindness of strangers. There's no way to, you don't sort of make it, you don't do that trip and come back, and have a positive experience without having relied on the kindness of strangers an infinite number of times over the course of the trip. So it did sort of, I guess, teach me that you reinforce a lesson that about just being what's the saying, leap and the net will appear a little bit, and that it's also always good to do things you're a little scared to do. I mean, I remember being on boarding the flight to China in the darkness, not knowing that I was about to set out on this trip without knowing anybody in any of these places or speaking any of the languages, and being kind of having a moment where I was like, what did I just sign up for here? But that's great. And those are the best experiences. And I definitely, it just confirmed that notion to me that you shouldn't do something if you're not a little scared to do it. It's probably not worth doing. Pack light, and bring some journals, and just be make the most of every day. It's important to be focused on your research project. That is a big part of what you're doing there, but be open to the possibility that the biggest impact that the trip will have will be on your character and who you are, and not just the research that you're doing and what you're there to learn. I still look back and think of it as just a life-altering experience, and something I just feel very lucky to have had the chance to do. So I think it probably informs my worldview and perspective in ways that I can't even fully articulate, because it's so embedded in that worldview and perspective, because it was so formative in my life. It is a unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get to know the world and yourself. I think that now, in a time when our country and the world are and feel so polarized, and when there is a this active efforts made in this country and around the world to divide people and target people based on their backgrounds and beliefs and identities, it's certainly as important, if not more important, than it ever has been to make an effort to understand each other. And the way to do that is not just by sitting at home and reading or watching some Netflix documentaries. It's by getting out there and seeing the world and getting to know people around the world in different contexts, and having a drink with them at a bar or hostel or something. And that's what I felt very privileged to do. And I think that's one of the extraordinary gifts that the grant gives, is in all these ways, sort of big and small for the recipients. It sort of helps them come to know the world a little bit better, and understand all the, helps build bridges. I feel very lucky to be a part of the 50-year history of the Circumnavigators grant. The grant really did change my life. A lot of other young people out there don't even know it yet, but they'll have the chance at some point in the future to take part in this grant and have their lives changed forever too. And we need people in positions of authority who have a willingness to understand, people who are not like them, and understand the importance of sort of all of us getting to know each other, who have a sort of breadth of experience and perspective to understand the richness and diversity of experiences and perspectives in the world and cultures. And this grant, helps create that. Helps create that for the students. Helps create that future.